So in this video, we're going to talk about synthesis, which is a sort of higher order source handling skill that you can use having mastered quotation and summary and paraphrase. Synthesis is not just a series of summaries. That's the first mistake most people make when they're asked to write a synthesis. They're like, well, I've got 3 sources, so I'm just going to write 3 summaries. Rather, it's blending multiple things into one coherent thing. So in this diagram that we have here, we've got 3 sources, source B, source A, source C, and they all get funneled into one argument. Or if you want to imagine it, if you've ever looked really closely at like a piece of yarn, and there might be multiple strings in that piece of yarn, and then they're twisted together like in a 3-ply piece of yarn. So you've got a thread from source B, a thread from source A, and a thread from source C, and they all make up that argument, but then that argument is spun together so that it becomes one unified thing, and it's not just pieces of each. You can tease apart those pieces just like you can with that yarn, but then it's not the same thing anymore. So in a synthesis, a truly well-written synthesis, then everything should be completely unified. So the other thing that a synthesis does is it gives you the big picture. It's summarizing the entire conversation, not just summarizing individual texts. So let's take a look at this is an example of not synthesis. This is typically what I get when I say, hey, write me a synthesis, and people are confused and then they have to do their revisions. And that's perfectly normal and natural. It's a complicated skill. So in this example, what we have is we have 3 summaries. We have a summary of an article by Donald Diker, a summary of an article by Nancy Summers, and a summary of an article by Thomas Newkirk. And they're all talking about how teachers should respond to student writing. So this is a typical first attempt. Any of these paragraphs might appear in an annotated bibliography, and they would be perfectly fine. So what this student might have done is taken their annotated bibliography and simply taken their annotations and put them into this paper. But we don't have really any connection between the ideas. If you read this carefully, you'll find that there isn't really any transitional material here. And so it focuses on texts as discrete objects, that is, as individual items, rather than being in conversation with each other. And it doesn't really make sense not to have them in conversation with each other, because we're trying to answer the same question, which is how should instructors respond to student writing? So it's not very helpful to your audience to do this, because it doesn't actually answer the question. It gives them many answers, and it doesn't help them sort out what the connections between those answers might be. So the other reason that this doesn't work as a synthesis is that the author's voice gets lost. So our student author here doesn't seem to have a strong unifying voice in this essay, and that's a problem. It's a sign of weaker writing, and makes it harder for the audience to really follow what's going on. So this is a revised version. Notice there's actually fewer paragraphs, but the paragraphs are fuller, because in this case we've organized it not around each source, but around each point that the author has to make. So this is unified by a single argument, and we can see this argument in this thesis statement here. Response itself is a rhetorical act, and it gets repeated again at the end, where we say Diker's recommendation, or Newkirk's recommendation aligns with Summers and Diker's recommendations. The instructors must consider their own feedback as a rhetorical moment. So we have here a single argument that we start with and we end with, so that we know as readers what it is we're supposed to be taking away from this. And then it focuses on the connections. So right from the start, scholars seem to agree and we have this summary of what it is we're going to be talking about. And so we're saying, all right, all of these articles, even though they're very different articles, have some points of agreement, and that's what we're going to focus on. It's okay in a synthesis also to point out disagreements, but the point is that you need to make sure that it's clear to your reader what you're focusing on, and that's the connections. We've grouped together ideas. So this second paragraph here, the first paragraph is an introductory paragraph that gives us a big picture. The second paragraph focuses on how traditional instruction techniques with traditional comments on papers might not be functioning well. And then this third one focuses on Newkirk's experiment that looks at an alternative to traditional instruction, which is peer criticism. And then there's transitions that guide us through these connections. So although there isn't an explicit transition here where we say response itself is a rhetorical act, we do understand that this is introducing that. Here we have a more clear transition. We say in a somewhat different vein. So this is sort of like an on the other hand, or some other transitional phrase that shows us the connection here. It also positions the text as being in conversation with each other. So when we say things like Diker and Summers both note that, that puts them in conversation with each other. When we have this ending sentence where the recommendations align with these other recommendations, we're again showing where those connections are. And also we have the author's voice is stronger here. And that's because we're not focused on each text as an individual text, but rather on what it is that our author, who speaks at the beginning and end and throughout, is trying to tell us using these texts. So it's very important that the author's voice takes primary precedent here. So when are you going to use a synthesis? You'll use it in the literature review portion of a research paper, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about the IMRAD structure in later weeks. And you use it whenever you're presenting research in any audience situation. Look for synthesis in the real world. Whenever people are trying to give you a big picture and they're using a lot of sources to do so, there's probably some synthesis going on. So executive summaries in a business report or in a proposal, for instance, might use synthesis. News articles use synthesis very often. Informational materials use synthesis quite frequently. Anywhere where we have multiple sources being blended into one unified argument. So just pay attention to that. It's all around. And in the next video, we're going to talk a little more about the ethical dimensions of source handling, because we've talked about the mechanics of it in this video and the previous one.